What's up everyone, Jay here. Last week I talked about some of the rumors on the new 9800 X3D processor that could be coming out soon. What's funny, because after that I got an email from AMD talking about 9000 series updates, and I thought maybe it was gonna be about that, but no. AMD is actually doing some pretty interesting stuff with 9000 series, listening to kind of the negative feedback they got regarding the decisions they made. So we're gonna talk about that today. This may or may not actually make people a little more excited about 9700X and 9600X, but just listen to the information and you guys sound off down below. I'm curious as to whether or not AMD is doing a little bit too much backpedaling here. So we're talking about 9000 series, specifically 9600X and 9700X's warranted 105 watt CTDP mode, and it stands for configurable TDP. Essentially here, now what AMD is doing is basically saying, okay, fine, forget the efficiency increases that we've made to the CPU. If you were just like, I want power, I want all the clocks and boosts available to it, you can turn off the 65 watt mode, turn on 105 watt mode. It's different than PBO, we'll talk about that in a second though, and get yourself approximately up to 10% more faster. It doesn't say more faster, I'm saying more faster. The proper vernacular type, whatever. I digress. So 65 watt to 105 watt, we're talking 40 watt more power draw for up to 10% more power. So that shows you actually how much of a diminished return there is on increasing the power. So there's no specific mention about whether or not this is gonna up the clock speeds. I think what this is gonna potentially do is maybe just allow it to boost a little bit farther. But this is just about it not hitting that that power limit TDP as hard in certain games and stuff, and with more spiky workloads, means that we could see it go up to its like 5.6, 5.7, 5.8 single core speeds and stay there longer in games, which is a nice thing to see. The crazy thing about this though is it really goes to show how that additional efficiency is actually, I guess, a little more impressive than many of us actually gave it credit for, because to maintain those types of clocks and only gain up to 10% more performance with what, 80% more wattage or 75% more wattage, whatever it is, that's huge in terms of showing how far they've come. Now this is gonna be specifically on the AGESA PI 1.2.0.2, which is gonna be available to 600 series and future 800 series motherboards. So obviously if you're running a B650, X670, X670E, or the upcoming X870, X870E, this is gonna be a BIOS toggle. So I assume it would be built into Ryzen Master, that you can then just reboot the system and it'll be in that mode. Most people universally hate Ryzen Master, so I assume they would just go into the BIOS and toggle that anyway. Now the crazy thing about this too, is they're also talking about the performance optimizations built into Windows. So this is something that Hardware Unboxed talked heavily about on Twitter and did several videos about, how apparently Windows has been gimping the performance up to 10% for Ryzen processors kind of across the board. So there was this whole discussion about whether or not, and it was about specifically the admin profile, the hidden admin profile that exists in Windows, where if you were to enable that profile and run your benchmarks on that, you would see like a 10% uplift in performance. But it wasn't, initially people looked at that and said, oh man, 9000 series is being affected by Windows. But what Steve and Hardware Unboxed found was that it was actually affecting all 7000 and 9000 series processors, and potentially even some 5000 and older series processors. But, so you can't really call this a 9000 series optimization. It's more of a Windows and AMD Ryzen with AM5 optimization. So that's something that's coming out here. And these are gonna be specifically with branch prediction. And that's one of the things that was talked about with Steve. Steve found that. And it kind of sucks because as we're preparing for new CPU launches, it means we have to rerun all these tests again. And we have to run them again with the 105 watt mode. I'm starting to think moving forward with our methodology when it comes to testing these CPUs, I'm conflicted because out of the box is gonna be 65 watts. We'd like to do out of the box testing to say, if you're a new user, if you're new to PC, you may not know about this additional mode at all. You may never even go to the BIOS and know it's there. So do we test both and then have benchmark numbers for both? Or do we just go 105 mode? Anyway, I digress. So it's the update KB504157. It's no longer optional. It's like required for the Windows updates. And I'm wondering if that's actually the Windows update that Phil recently experienced on his system, because of the fact that he had updates paused on one of our laptops, but it ignored the fact that updates were paused and updated anyway. It might have updated this one if it's non-optional. Other thing too is for 23H2 build 22631.4112 or 24H2 build 2611.1301 or newer. So those are the branch prediction fixes, which was affecting the Ryzen 7000 series processors. So if you're running Windows 11 and you're on a Ryzen processor, even a 7000 series processor, you're gonna wanna do these updates because it could be a literal overnight improvement for latency and an uplift in your 1% lows and your FPS across the board. Big kudos to the Hardware Unboxed guys. They did a lot of pioneering on that one, and they really leaned heavily on AMD to get this fixed and to find out that this is something that they were already doing in their own lab. And by they, I mean AMD. The fact that they were already running these tests in admin mode is crazy because of the fact no one should ever run the admin mode as a full-time account. It is not intended for that purpose at all. The last thing you want to do is give any program whatsoever running in Windows full unfettered access to everything in your system. That's bad. It's one of the reasons why the admin mode is hidden for the admin account. Anyway, moving on. So again, huge thanks to the Hardware Unboxed guys for really pioneering that. You can see it's now officially talked about here. Something else that they're talking about here also is core-to-core latency optimizations. And this is something that could be big as well for 9000 series, 9900X, 9950X, and 7900X, 7900X3D, 7950X, and 7950X3D. Multiple CCD CPUs. So we're talking about an increase with that same AGESA, the 1.2.0.2. We're talking about a increase in the latency performance. So the problem, and one of the reasons why game mode in Ryzen Master just turns off one of the CCDs is doesn't even allow parking. It just says don't exist. So there's no chance of anything ever getting handed off there. Because they know that today they're still dealing with some latency stuff between the CCDs. And the problem is some very intensive games that have large worlds or a lot of background processes going on within the game that sometimes force information onto another CCD, then that latency can show up. And that latency often turns into lower overall FPS, which means bottlenecking for your graphics card. If you're running like say a 4080, 4090, 3090, or a fast graphics card at like 1440p, anytime you have to hand off to the other CCD, you're going to notice lower FPS across the board. So what would happen is that information would get written twice and read twice. So we could see a pretty decent uptick in performance on the multi-CCD CPUs that are not leveraging core parking. So core parking exists on the 9950X and the 9900X, but not the 7950X and the 7900X. So that's a new thing for 9000 series processors. 7900X3D, 7950X3D, both utilize core parking. So it's one of those things where core parking, this shouldn't end up being a problem. But again, some games can sometimes prefer maximum performance, which can then throw some information onto the other CCD. So any sort of CCD latency improvement is going to be big. It's nice to see these types of improvements coming out later on, especially with how well adopted 7000 series processors have been as well, because of the fact that we know that these are very desirable CPUs, they're very strong, and for users years later to still be seeing performance uplifts through improvements, it's nice to see. So kudos to that. There's also some changes here coming to x870 motherboards. Now DDR5 8000 Expo is reportedly going to be stable on these motherboards. So that's huge. And that whole crosstalk latency thing we were talking about with CCDs, the faster RAM is also directly related to the Infinity Fabric, which is going to help with that communication. So fast RAM, it's huge. And having better latency between the CCDs is definitely going to be one of those uplifts that's nice to see. So AMD is trying to find ways to make the 800 series motherboard seem more enticing to buyers, because I think for most people, I've even been suggesting, if you're going to go with a 9950X or a 9900X or 9000 series processor, go with a 6000 or 600 series motherboard, B650, X670, X670E, because there's very little, I think, reasons to buy a more expensive motherboard. But if these are some things that are going to be behind, say, the 800 series firewall or paywall, which is going to be fast RAM support and all that, it's time to really evaluate what's important to you when it comes to your motherboard RAM speed. I think that's going to be one of the biggest things right there, might potentially be RAM improvement, which is interesting because the I/O die on the CPU handles all that anyway. Like the memory controller and all that is handled on the CPU. So interesting to see here. Anyway, we'll put it on the screen right here. You guys can kind of pause it and take a look. You can see what the chipset family support is going to be for both 600 series and 800 series, and it's got some yes, no optional functions on there so you can see what feature is going to be most important to you. But I think this is a good thing. I think the warranted 105 mode is huge. Give users the option, because the only way right now to really push those CPUs and get any sort of performance out of them is to enable PBO. Unfortunately, Precision Boost Overdrive, although a function that is very simple to just toggle on and off in both BIOS and in Ryzen Master, is a warranty voiding function. So I don't know what methods AMD is using to try and determine if someone's gone and enabled PBO, whether it's an eFuse or I don't know how they're knowing, but apparently they're knowing, which is why a lot of people get mad about PBO and voiding warranties. My question is going to be, if someone's already enabled PBO, let's say they even did a manual like 105 watt mode to just make it match previous gen. Did it trigger the eFuse? Is there an eFuse? How does AMD know? Are they still going to warranty those processors now that enable the new CTDP of 105 watt? So that's my biggest question for AMD is, how are you going to now backwards support CPUs that have been floating around the market now for months that might have already quote unquote voided their warranties through PBO now that you're offering something very similar? So I'd love to see some discussion on that. And I think given everything that's been going on with Intel right now, the best thing for AMD to do would just be like blanket reinstated warranties across the board for everybody. If you have a 9000 series processor, short of physical damage, warranted. That could be the best possible scenario. So that's kind of it for today's little news article. They talked about this on Friday. The embargo lifted today on this information. I feel like this is also AMD scrambling to try and get as much benefit and value to their CPUs that are existing before the X3D CPUs launch, because we know that Intel is launching something here in about a week. So I think this is about to be the CPU battle royale, if you will. So we have the ultimate letdown versus the ultimate untrustworthy. That's a UFC fight to remember, right? Do you just buy the one that's disappointing, or do you just take a chance with the one you can't trust? All right, guys. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Sound off down below if you've got a 9000 series processor that is going to benefit from the 105 mode. I assume there's no reason not to enable it. Oh, one last thing I wanted to mention. I feel like personally, they should just launch at 105. They should just default 105. 65 watt mode should be the one you can enable. I personally feel like you should have a new efficiency mode that enables 65 watt. They ship at 105 for max performance. If there's no degradation, if the die is current, I mean, remember this is a separate process from 7000 series, so we can't just say it's a paper launch or whatever, not a paper launch, but a rebrand. Right? We just can't call it a relabel or whatever, because it is a physical different process. As long as that process isn't going to show degradation at 105, and I'm hoping that means it won't, which is why they're warrantying it, let that be the default on these BIOS. And then let efficiency mode be the toggle, because most new people, almost nobody is going to go into their BIOS being new to PC and look to turn this mode on. They're going to be sitting there with lesser than optimal performance that's capable by them just not knowing about it. And all of these videos reach thousands and thousands of people. That is a fraction of the millions and millions of people that are running these things out in the wild that just do not nerd out about it like we do. So AMD, please let it be the default 105. That would be my only suggestion on this. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Sound off down below. And as always, we'll see you in the next one.